all, and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another Florida Amazing 10. Today's video is in honor of the 50th anniversary of the opening of Walt Disney World in October 1971. But instead of looking at Walt Disney World, I'm doing something a bit different. In the 1970s, Orlandoans often talked about Orlando BD and Orlando AD, before Disney and after Disney. Some 50 years later, many Floridians have the opinion that there weren't any tourist attractions in the Orlando area before 1971. In reality, there were few places in the state that weren't touched by tourism in the mid-20th century. This video will take a look at 10 attractions near Orlando that predated Disney World. Enjoy! Before I get to the list, I want to make a note of two things. Firstly, the attractions are not all in Orlando itself, but are nearby. But after all, Walt Disney World is nearly 25 miles from downtown Orlando itself. Secondly, I want to cover the brief timeline of the start of Disney World. As you can see by this graphic, Disney's involvement in Central Florida dates to 1963, with Walt Disney's flight over the area. It was on that flight that Disney chose to place his new creation near the intersection of Florida's Turnpike and Interstate 4. All 10 of the attractions I'll cover predate even that 1963 date. In fact, only 3 of them were founded after World War II. Amazing Orlando attraction number 1, Big Tree Park. In a swampy area that's connected with Lake Jesup rests Big Tree Park. Owned by Seminole County, the park is rather appropriately located just north of the city of Longwood. The property was donated to the county in 1929 by landowner and Florida State Senator Moses Overstreet. Overstreet owned a sawmill and turpentine business. Apart from donating the land, Overstreet's title of senator was given to the star of Big Tree Park, the largest and oldest bald cypress tree in the world. Estimated to be 3,500 years old, it was likely a seedling when Stonehenge reached its final stage of construction. Prior to a hurricane in 1925, the height was 165 feet or 50 meters. That storm knocked its height down to 118 feet. The tree was well known in the late 19th century. At the time, the only way to reach it was to jump from log to log, risking a splash in the swamp. When the park opened, a simple wooden walkway led to the center. The park was popular with locals who regularly brought their vacationing relatives and friends to look at the massive tree. Then in 2012, everything changed. A fire was observed in the center, and while it was thought to have been the result of a lightning strike, an investigation revealed it was due to a local person who intentionally lit a fire in the hollow of the tree in order to take drugs. The person was subsequently caught and convicted, but given a suspended sentence. Later convicted of an unrelated charge, the person was required to serve the original sentence. Unfortunately, the center was burned to the ground. Only a few charred parts of its base remain. Still, people continued to visit. The park has a playground and a modern boardwalk that not only takes visitors to the remains of the senator, but leads them a little further into the swamp to see Lady Liberty, another massive bald cypress that is 89 feet or 27 meters high and about 2,000 years old. Plus, near the playground, there is Phoenix, yet another cypress, but one that is a clone of the senator. Big Tree Park is a remarkable place. It's both a memorial to an ancient tree as well as a celebration of cypress trees in general. The bald cypress is one of the most important trees in Florida's ecosystem, and the park is a great place to learn about them. Amazing Orlando attraction number 2, Wakaya Springs State Park. There are so many large springs in the upper half of Florida that many people simply consider them the local swimming hole. There's about 25 first-magnitude springs in the state, producing at least 65 million gallons a day, with the largest pouring out nearly 650 million gallons from the Florida aquifer. Wakaya is one of 2 springs in Orange County, northwest of Orlando. It's a second-magnitude spring, releasing about 43 million gallons of water a day, or 160 million liters. To put that in perspective, the springs would be able to fill more than 65 Olympic-sized pools every day. Now, before I get into the history, let's take a look at the name. Wakaya Springs. The river that's created is informally called Wakaya. Nearby businesses are split on which name they've chosen to use. Even the road, which runs along the southern border of the state park, confusingly switches from Wakaya Springs to Wakaya Springs Road about 1,000 feet to the east of the park entrance. It's known that Wakaya is a Muskogee language word that means spring. Muskogee is the language of the Seminole tribe, the indigenous people who moved into Florida due to the encroachment of white settlers in their traditional homeland in Alabama and Georgia. It's been argued that while Wakaya means creek, Wakaya means flowing water. However, the Muskogee language doesn't use the consonant sound V. What likely happened is that Wakaya was used by land developers, probably because it's easier to pronounce by English speakers. Wakaya, like most of Florida's springs, was well known by the indigenous culture that existed for thousands of years before European discovery. It was known by American settlers to the area in the 1830s, and after the Civil War it was eventually developed into a park for swimming, boating, and fishing. At the time it was known as Clay Springs, after the then property owner. The first real development appears in the 1890s, arguably making the area the first organized attraction in Orange County. This development was the construction of a small hotel and boathouse. In 1941, the Apopka Sportsman Club purchased much of the land around the springs from a turpentine company. They used the property for hunting and fishing until 1969, when the state purchased it and began developing the Wakaya Springs State Park. The Wakaya River is protected under the National Wild and Scenic River System, a program that is designed to protect rivers that possess outstandingly remarkable scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife, historic, cultural, or other similar values. It's one of only 2 rivers in Florida to receive the designation, the other being the Loxahatchee in Palm Beach and Martin counties. Wakaya has an unusual tourism history. It began simply as a swimming hole for locals after the Civil War. It developed into an actual attraction in the 1890s. This era lasted for about 25 years until the property started to be used for turpentine production. In 1941, it became the Sportsman Club. It wasn't until 1969 that the springs became fully open to the public once again. With its large spring-fed pool, many miles of hiking trails, and a wide river for canoe and kayak exploration, the park is one of the most popular parks in the state park system. Amazing Orlando attraction number 3, Gatorland. Known initially as the Florida Wildlife Institute when it opened in 1949, its owners, the Godwin family, realized fairly quickly that a more marketable name would be best for the attraction located south of Orlando on U.S. Route 441. Owen and Pearl Godwin first renamed it Snake Village and Alligator Farm. At the time, it was just a few acres in size, and its buildings were primarily constructed by Seminoles who were paid to live on the property and work the attraction. The new name didn't seem to make much of an impact, and in 1954 they finally hit upon a name that would succeed, Gatorland. This was the golden age of Florida tourism, and Gatorland was located on one of the state's major roads, US 441, better known as the Orange Blossom Trail. The park got its first star attraction, an American saltwater crocodile named Bone Crusher that was 15 feet or 4.5 meters long and reportedly weighing over 1,000 pounds or 454 kilograms. The Godwins lived on the property with their home, sharing the same building as the gift shop. In the early 60s, a set of massive alligator jaws were placed at the entrance. The jaws were created by Owen and Pearl's son Frank. They quickly became the number 1 reason travelers stopped at the park. Today, they're still one of the most iconic sites in Florida's tourism history. During the 1960s, Owen would take numerous trips to places around the world to purchase exotic animals for Gatorland. The park ended up being one of the largest alligator farms in Florida, and it slowly added other animal exhibits, with the focus being Florida native animals such as panthers, bobcats, and raccoons. Gatorland currently has a large number of American alligators as well as examples of other crocodiles from around the world. They have very rare white gators, both albino and leucistic ones, as well as an interesting collection of snakes. One of the park's most important roles is that of being a rookery for wild water birds such as egrets, herons, storks, and ibis. Hundreds of birds nest on the property each spring and raise their young, many little more than an arm's length from the visitors. It's easy to see up to 15 different bird species nesting in trees just above the breeding pond that contains well over 100 gators. As of 2021, Gatorland continues to be popular with visitors, and it is one of the more interesting zoos in the state. Amazing Orlando attraction number 4, Scenic Boat Tour. One of the most unassuming attractions in the entire state is located on the shore of Lake Osceola at the end of Morse Boulevard in downtown Winter Park. At a small secluded dock on the west side of the lake sit several pontoon boats and the seating area that has been the only physical possessions of Winter Park's Scenic Boat Tour for many years. Founded just prior to World War II in 1938, the attraction is simple in format. Up to 18 passengers ride on an open boat with a pilot who also serves as a tour guide. Visitors rarely see anything exciting, but it's a fascinating one-hour trip that touches on architecture, history, and nature. The tour was opened by W.C. Malone, who was originally from New England, like so many of Winter Park's early transplants. The trip has an interesting twist few, if any, other boat tours in the state offer. Lake Osceola is just one of 7 lakes in the Winter Park chain of lakes, a grouping of natural lakes that were connected with constructed canals that date back 130 or more years. Originally built by lumber companies, the canals typically used the narrow streams that connected the lakes during high water times. They were used to float logs from one lake to another to get them from harvesting sites to sawmills. The canals were originally shorn up with cypress wood timber. By the 1930s, the loggers were long gone, as were much of the cypress supports, so Winter Park and Maitland began a process to rebuild the canals to make them accessible to the new motorboats that were becoming common. The process was mostly completed before World War II began. About 40 years later, the process was repeated. Today, several of the canals are still navigable, at least by small boats. The modern pontoon boats of the Scenic Tour barely fit and occasionally bump into the walls of the 2 canals they pass through, though usually that's due to waves caused by another boat. The tour visits 3 lakes, Osceola, Virginia, and Maitland, and passes through the 2 canals twice. On the trip, guests will see Rollins College, Kraft Azalea Park, the Polasek Art Museum, and dozens of valuable homes, some owned by reasonably famous people. There are plenty of water birds and often plenty of other lake traffic, including water skiers, paddleboarders, and jet skiers. The canals can be the highlight of the trip, with low bridges, semi-tropical foliage growing over the boats, and the possibility of meeting an oncoming boat. The scenic boat tours remain popular today and are a cool addition to a day exploring Winter Park. Amazing Orlando attraction number 5, Rollins College. While there are plenty of reasons to visit a college campus, very few would be considered tourist attractions. That being said, Rollins College in Winter Park, which considers itself to be the oldest recognized college in Florida, has been popular with tourists for many years. The Mediterranean Revival architecture, the beautiful Knowles Memorial Chapel, and the college's location at the southern end of Winter Park's main street, Park Avenue, all helped it to become a highly visible and highly visited campus. Founded in 1885, many of its buildings date from the first 40 years of the 20th century. The campus sits on the north shore of Lake Virginia, one of the Winter Park chain of lakes. Apart from the campus itself, Rollins was a popular attraction because of 2 museums that were both established in 1942. The Beale Maltby Shell Museum housed one of the largest collections of salt and freshwater shells in the world. Collected by James Beale beginning in 1888, he chose to donate them to Rollins. Beale's close friend, Birdsey Maltby, presented the school with funds to build an appropriate museum and study center. For more details on the history of this important museum, check out my video that covers both its story as well as interesting information on shell collecting and an interview with the invertebrate zoology collection manager at the Florida Museum of Natural History. The Beale Maltby closed in 1988 and the building was repurposed, though it has kept its name. The collection was donated to the University of Florida, but you can learn more about that in the video I just mentioned. The second museum was the Morse Gallery of Art. The Morse was founded in 1942 by Jeanette Genius McKean and named for her grandfather, Chicago industrialist and Winter Park philanthropist Charles Hosmer Morse. Its collection was built over a half-century by McKean and her husband Hugh McKean, an art professor who also became the museum's director. In its early days, the museum mostly displayed American art objects that were on loan from other museums and individuals. One exhibition in 1955 provided the start to the museum's most significant connection with an artist. The exhibition, titled Works of Art by Louis Comfort Tiffany, featured objects by one of America's most influential and successful artists, known for works in glass, ceramics, metal, and enamels. Tiffany, who died in 1933, was most famous for his stained glass lamps and his design work for his family's luxury item store, Tiffany & Company. 2 years after the exhibition, Tiffany's mansion, Laurelton Hall, was destroyed by fire, and the McKeans were able to rescue a great deal of the art and even architectural elements from the home. This would end up giving the museum a new focus. In 1978, the McKeans moved the collection off the Rollins campus into Winter Park. It would be renamed the Charles Hosmer Morse Museum of American Art in 1987, and in 1995 it moved to its current location on Park Avenue, only about 10 blocks north of its original location. While the museum has an interesting collection of American art, it's the Tiffany works that have made it famous. It holds the most comprehensive collection of the artist's works, and much of the museum's display space is dedicated to Tiffany. The Morse is unusual because of its collection. Like the Salvador Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, it's one of very few art museums in the world that house a large and representative portion of the works of a world-renowned artist. Museums such as these allow visitors and historians to understand an artist from their early development on to their maturity. The Morse provides glimpses of Tiffany's life work, from intricate jewelry that represent Tiffany & Company to experimental works, from architectural elements of Laurelton Hall, designed by Tiffany, to monumental pieces including the Tiffany Chapel he created for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. The museum is one of the most important art museums in Florida, one that's great to visit whether you're an adult or a child. Amazing Orlando attraction number 6, San Lando Springs. San Lando Springs, so named because it's between the two cities of Sanford and Orlando, is yet another of Florida's many springs. One of the most southerly in the state, its flow is quite a bit smaller than Wakaya's, about 8.5 million gallons or 32 million liters a day. Like Wakaya, it was an early swimming hole for locals. It was initially named Hoosier Springs by an Ingram Fletcher, though little else is known about the area before the 1920s. Located in Longwood, the undeveloped property was owned by Senator Moses Overstreet of Big Tree fame. In 1925, Overstreet sold it to the mayor of Altamont Springs, James Franklin Haithcox, who changed the name to San Lando. Haithcox attempted to develop the springs into an amusement park, but in only a few short years it failed due to the Great Depression, and it was repossessed by Overstreet. The park reopened in 1935 and was an inexpensive and popular attraction. There were many events held at the springs, including beauty contests and concerts. During World War II, there were regular evening dances. The main spring-fed pond had a large slide, and there was even a large in-ground pool. Early on, the small natural pools that were filled by the flow of spring water were dammed to connect and enlarge them. This allowed the attraction to have a short jungle cruise through tropical gardens. There was also a restaurant and lounge, picnicking area, white sand beaches, and even cottages for rental. There were several distinct swimming areas, including the pool, obviously, as well as the broad sandy beach and a little cove that was where the spring emptied out the Florida aquifer's water. G.E. Robinson would own the park in the 50s and 60s, but due to declining profits and increasing expenses, Robinson sold it to developers in 1970. The area was closed to the public, mostly drained and divided up into lots for a housing subdivision. As of 2021, the neighborhood is fairly unremarkable, though it has 5 ponds scattered around it, several of which have bubbling springs to keep them full. Amazing Orlando attraction number 7, Tupperware Museum of Dishes. Just over the border into Osceola County, less than a mile south of Gatorland on U.S. Route 441, sits Tupperware's corporate offices. As of 2021, it's officially known as Tupperware Global Headquarters, but back when it opened in 1954, it was known as the National Headquarters of Tupperware Home Parties. The Home Parties designation meant that at first, the offices were meant only for what was the sales division of the housewares company, but eventually became the HQ for the entire company, known today as Tupperware Brands Corporation. Originally founded in 1946 by Earl Tupper, that's where the name came from, within a few short years it became a massively successful business that sold sealable plastic storage containers. Tupper invented the initial designs that were made from forms of plastic that had little other use, making the material very cheap. The other side of the success story included a team of executives led by Brownie Wise and thousands of housewives who were the main sales force. Tupperware Home Parties describes the way the product was sold. While Tupperware didn't invent the home party sales technique, they developed the concept into a process that made the company millions of dollars, and at a time when few married women worked outside the home, they provided housewives with a way to earn real money and gain a level of independence. For the 1950s, this was a radical change. Brownie Wise was the head of the sales division and developed much of the corporate culture. She became a public figure, initially due to her direct communication with the sales force, and later through magazine interviews and TV appearances. All of that was coordinated from these offices. Unfortunately, Tupper had a volatile nature, and while it was obvious that the brand's success was largely due to Wise, the head of sales was summarily dismissed in 1958. All traces of Wise disappeared from the Tupperware literature, and a short time later, Tupper sold the entire company to Dart Enterprises for $16 million, the equivalent of $152 million in 2021. As can be seen from this 1955 brochure of the Orange Blossom Trail, Tupperware had its museum from very early on. As this booklet from 1957 states, enjoy a tour of the Magic Kitchen, Exhibit Home, Museum of Dishes, Consumer Lounge, and the Scenic Gardens and Lagoons. One of the highlights of the museum was the Evolution of Dishes mural. This huge painting was made up of 10 panels with an overall measurement of 10 by 40 feet. Of course, the museum was designed to promote Tupperware, but that was hardly unusual at the time. Even Disneyland, which opened in 1955, had several displays that promoted companies such as the Monsanto House of the Future and the Kaiser Aluminum Hall of Fame. Tupperware actively promoted the museum, as can be seen from these Orange Blossom Trail brochures. They were a member of the OBT Association, while their neighbor, Gatorland, wasn't. While the museum was regularly updated, by the 1990s it was experiencing a decline in attendance, and it was reduced in size until today it's really just a small display of Tupperware history and a gift shop. Currently called the Confidence Center, it's mostly visited by Tupperware staff who visit the headquarters for training and meetings. As you can see from the photos, the current look of the museum is sleek and modern, and appropriately includes a tribute to Brownie Wise. Amazing Orlando attraction number 8, Mead Botanical Garden. Sitting on 55 acres of land in the midst of a residential neighborhood, Mead Garden has a bit in common with the Scenic boat tour. Howell Creek runs through the garden connecting Lake Sioux to Lake Virginia. It's too small for any real boat, but if it was enlarged, the boat tour could visit yet another beautiful site in Winter Park. Mead Garden was created to honor Theodore L. Mead, a world-renowned horticulturalist who developed varieties of orchids, caladiums, ferns, bromeliads, and many other semi-tropical plants. Mead and his wife Edith moved to Oviedo in 1886 in order to continue his work on creating new plant species. His work in the area included a partnership with Rollins College until his death in 1936. After his death, Two of his friends, Jack Connery and Dr. Edwin Grover, looked for a location to keep all of Mead's orchids and hopefully create a garden in his memory. The two settled on the property on Howell Creek, which was undeveloped and featured wetlands and an abundance of wildlife. Several Winter Park residents, including Senator Walter Rose and Winter Park Mayor James Treat, offered some of their land, as did Orange County. Building the park used a $62,000 grant from the Works Progress Administration, a federal bureau operating during the Depression era. The creek was deepened and widened, and they drained the swampy areas. Several miles of trails were created, and they added azaleas to much of the park. They also added a nursery area to maintain Mead's plants, along with greenhouses for the valuable orchids. The garden opened in 1940, and from the beginning it had a close connection with Rollins College, with both botany and biology classes using it as an open laboratory. This made sense considering Dr. Grover was Rollins College's vice president and a professor, and Connery was a student. The garden also hosted flower shows, fashion shows, and concerts. In 1953, it was given to the city of Winter Park, and in 1956, the Winter Park Garden Club began meeting in the garden. In 1959, an amphitheater was built for weddings, fashion shows, and other events. It remained a popular spot for visitors throughout the 60s, but by the late 70s, the garden was looking run down. Unfortunately, the slow deterioration continued for many years. In 1982, Winter Park crews began work to maintain the garden, but their work was not enough, and it was becoming obvious that the garden needed to have a significant restoration. In 1988, Mayor David Johnston finally set up a Mead Garden Task Force, and the Orlando chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects assisted the group with a master plan for revitalization. While some work was done, another task force was organized in 1991, and yet one more in 2003. Progress was being made, but the three major hurricanes that pummeled Central Florida in 2004 destroyed a great deal of the garden. In the aftermath, significant funding from private individuals, nonprofit organizations, and governmental agencies allowed significant restoration to happen. Much of the park was repaired and improved. As of 2021, Mead Garden was in good shape and was regularly hosting events. The garden is open to the public, free of charge, and has many fascinating areas to visit. It remains one of the highlights of the Orlando area. Amazing Orlando attraction number 9, Central Florida Zoo. Inauspiciously beginning with the donation of a monkey to the custodian of the Sanford Elks Club, the Central Florida Zoo began in 1923. That monkey, a rhesus macaque, was subsequently given to the Sanford Fire Department. The fire department soon ended up collecting a number of other animals, growing large enough for it to become a small attraction. The following year, the menagerie was moved to a lot next to the police department and jail. At that location, the animals were being cared for by both police officers and inmates. At first it was known as the Police Zoo, but eventually it became the Sanford Municipal Zoo. The zoo grew large enough that in 1941 it moved to a new location on the Sanford lakefront, where it would remain a popular attraction for over 30 years. This early part of the zoo is covered in detail in this video. By the 1970s, the zoo's location was far too small and the facilities very dated, so by 1976 land on Lake Monroe, west of Sanford, was secured and the zoo was moved. At the same time, it was renamed the Central Florida Zoo. Today it's one of the better small zoos in the state, and even though it had an odd beginning, it's one of Florida's oldest zoos, with only the St. Augustine Alligator Farm and the Jacksonville Zoo being older. Amazing Orlando attraction number 10, Liu Gardens. Owned by the City of Orlando, Liu Gardens is the only attraction on this list within the city limits of Orlando. It's also the newest attraction on this list, having opened to the public in 1961, just 2 years before Walt Disney's famous flight. Of course, there's a long list of botanical gardens in the state. Many cities have them, such as Sarasota, St. Petersburg, Miami, Vero Beach, and Lake Wales. I've talked about several of them in this video. The majority of Florida's botanical gardens began in one of two ways. Either they were directly developed to be an attraction, or they were developed to be a private garden that was eventually converted into public gardens. Liu Gardens is one of the latter. The property on which Liu Gardens sits can tell a story older than the development of the gardens, however. The land was first homesteaded by Angeline and David Mizell in 1858, some 3 years before the start of the Civil War. They grew cotton, sugarcane, and corn. At the conclusion of the war, during the Reconstruction era, David was elected sheriff of Orange County. In 1870, David Mizell was ambushed and murdered by members of the Barber family, another of the area's first settlers. Due to the ensuing Barber-Mizell feud, at least 2 other families were involved, and the result was violent deaths of over 40 individuals. At some point, I'll cover the feud in a video as it connects to several important places in the state, one of them being Liu Gardens. Not only did the Mizells live on the land, they're buried here. Yes, one of the most popular botanical gardens in Florida also contains a small family cemetery. The house that sits in the center of the gardens is also the Mizells', well, at least part of it. The central part was theirs until 1902, when Duncan Pell and Helen Gardner purchased the land and had John Mizell, the son of Angeline and David, build additions to the house. Not long after, Martha and Joseph Woodward purchased the house and made some final additions. Then in 1936, Mary Jane and Harry Liu purchased the property. As the name suggests, they were the final private owners, and crucially, it was they who created the Botanical Gardens. The Lius donated the entire property to the city of Orlando in 1961. Liu Gardens is essentially unique. It has remained at 50 acres on the southeast shore of Lake Rowena for over 150 years. The only development is the historic Mizell Liu House and the Garden House, which was opened in 1995 for exhibitions, classes, concerts, and other activities. The garden is more diverse than many of Florida's other gardens, with sections for roses, palms, cycads, bamboo, cacti, and other succulents, herbs, vegetables, citrus, and large sections devoted to camellias. There is also a dramatic tropical stream garden, butterfly garden, and an area of woods that start with cypress on the shore of the lake and rise in elevation to land suited for oaks. Liu Gardens is a quiet and charming attraction located near the center of the city. With its combination of beautiful gardens and fascinating history, it's one of the best botanical gardens in the state. It's a shame it's not better known. As you can see, the Orlando area was well acquainted with tourist attractions long before Walt Disney decided to make the area home to his largest building project ever. Thank you for watching another of my videos. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.